settle down. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Saurabh Goyal, and I am happy to introduce to you our guest speaker today, Mr. V. Srinivas. Before I begin, please bear in mind that whatever I say in his introduction is bound to be an understatement. His achievements and accomplishments are so many that if I were to mention even half of them, I would end up giving a speech of my own today. Mr. Mr. V. Srinivas is an IAS officer of 1989 batch. He is presently posted as Chairman Rajasthan Tax Board with additional charge of Chairman Board of Revenue for Rajasthan Ajmer. Among various other roles, he has served as Private Secretary to Finance Minister of India, Advisor to Executive Director India at IMF, and Planning and Finance Secretary Government of Rajasthan. Sir holds a postgraduate degree in Chemical Engineering from Osmania University. He has been a champion badminton player at school and college level. He was also a member of Andhra Pradesh team to National Badminton Championships. Today, he is going to speak to us about India's relationship with IMF since 1944 and what lessons it holds for our future. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome our speaker today, Mr. V. Srinivas.
A very good afternoon. It's taken me about 3 decades of knowledge assimilation to address the 92nd foundation course of probationers today. I returned to the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, Mussoorie, on the same train route that I had taken when I came here last for the phase 2 of my professional course. The travel time is almost 15 hours, and I hope that this hour-long interaction with you is worth the effort to inspire you to contribute significantly to policy making and nation building. I came to the academy at 22, an age where idealism and enthusiasm pervaded me. This academy instilled in me the core values of deep commitment for better governance, a seriousness of purpose, and a deep knowledge of India's agrarian economy and land reforms. In my first decade of service, I rigorously pursued the cause of land reforms, land sealing, tenancy, and protection of common lands, both as a sub-collector and as a district collector. I spent 2 years in the Thar Desert constructing the Indira Gandhi Canal in a very harsh terrain, developing 21 lakh hectares of command lands. I also worked for the cause of the rain-fed farmers, fighting for drought moderation in Rajasthan's chronic rain-fed areas. Institution building, developing stronger and sustainable institutions that can compete against global institutions became my sole obsession in 3 decades in governance. I spent my second and third decades in national policy making, in public finance, external affairs, trade and commerce, where I learned the importance of India's multilateral and bilateral relationships and contributed to India's quest for her rightful place on the global high table of nations. The International Monetary Fund is one of the truly great global institutions where I served from 2003 to 2007. I also headed the National Archives of India and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences for the periods 2013 to 17. Currently, I head one of the largest judicial institutions of India, the Board of Revenue for Rajasthan and the Rajasthan Tax Board. Strong institutions are the lifeline of Indian democracy, and institution builders are men of substance and courage. I have requested my liaison officer, Saurabh Goyal, to share with you my paper titled Institution Builders, a tribute to 8 legendary Indian Administrative Service officers with whom I have served with. Before I go into the PowerPoint presentation, a small advice for young nascent careers. Today, you represent the aristocracy of India's administrative merit. Merit is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. Some of the traits by the high achievers in Indian civil service are that they were high achievers at a young age. They worked on important problems. They had a fierce motivation and emotional commitment to the societal cause. They worked longer hours than their contemporaries with a tremendous passion for excellence. They presented their achievements to the world cogently and coherently. Through my 3 decades in service, tremendous recognition has been bestowed on me through a series of challenging assignments. The foundation for a high-profile career goes back to long hours spent in reading and writing in the Academy's Gandhi Library, Diplomacy by Kissinger, World War II by Churchill, The Rise and Fall of Nations by Paul Kennedy, The Price of Glory, Verdun, 1916, by Alistair Horn, Stalingrad by Anthony Beever were some of the books that I read with great passion in those years. Before I introduce you to the subject, I'd like to thank the Director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration and the Deputy Director Senior for the opportunity. I'd like to thank my liaison officer, Saurabh Goyal, for the introduction. I've served myself as liaison officer twice in my probation period to the Cabinet Secretary, Naresh Chandra, and Mr. Ribeiro, who was then the Director General of Police of Maharashtra. They always said institutions rise and fall with individuals. So let me inspire all of you to make a difference. So let me go to the presentation. Okay. Okay. Right. Yes. Yes. Let me introduce you to the International Monetary Fund, and the subject of the discussion is India's economic history. India's economic history not only covers the macroeconomic policy making that we have indulged in, but also 2 great institutions that we've had, the Reserve Bank of India and the Planning Commission, which is now called the Niti Aayog. So I'll run you through the major milestones that India's economy has witnessed in the last 70 years since independence, and I'll also run you through the Reserve Bank of India and the Niti Aayog. So kindly bear with me for the next half an hour, and this subject is part of a research paper and a book research proposal that I'm undertaking titled India and the IMF. India is a founder member of the IMF, as also the World Bank, the Bretton Woods sister institutions. India's tremendous commitment to multilateralism and democracy saw us participating at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference at Bretton Woods in July 1944, well before we got independence. It was attended by 44 member countries. We were represented by a 6-member delegation. There was a very brilliant Indian civil service officer named Sir C.D. Deshmukh, and it's a name that we will find resonance in many economic circles. He became the governor of the Reserve Bank of India at 47 and went on to become the finance minister of India at 54. So he's a name whose biography you can look up in the library. And Sir C.D. Deshmukh was the Indian nominee on this, along with the then finance minister, Sir John Reisman, and there were 2 people who were nominated from the Tatas, Mr. A.D. Shroff and John Mathai. John Mathai further went on to become the finance minister of India. There were a lot of reservations whether we should join the IMF as an original member, because we felt that it was contributing to the United States' dominant international hegemony. However, we felt that we need a lender of last resort in a global context, and India joined this institution. We had the 5th largest quota in 1945, and as of 2016, we are the 8th largest quota on the IMF. India has been a poster boy of the International Monetary Fund. In fact, several managing directors, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, one of the most charismatic managing directors who's visited India a number of times, as also the current managing director, Christine Lagarde, had a lot of good words to say. We are often clubbed with China as a major growth engine of the world economy. Here is your country. This is a special moment for India. Just as many countries around the world are grappling with low growth, India has been marching in the opposite direction. This year already, India's growth rate is expected to exceed that of China. The conditions are ripe for India to become a key engine for global growth. As India grows and takes its rightful place in the global economy, the focus should remain on sound policies and inclusive institutions. At the current juncture, the world needs a vibrant India, and India needs the world. Today, the elements are all aligned to make India a global powerhouse. So this is India's movement. A few months later, we became the world's fastest growing major economy. Now, what is the role of the International Monetary Fund in a global context? The International Monetary Fund, in its lending practices, seeks to help member countries to attain over a medium term a viable balance of payments position. We can have high growth, which is inspired by individual members themselves through large-scale fiscal expansion. However, in terms of balance of payment, whenever there's a run on the currencies or a banking crisis, there is a lender of last resort. And the IMF represents that lender of last resort, and they have formulated several empirical underpinnings for what is called fund conditionality. The first one of these is reducing domestic expenditure to avoid monetary expansion. This is followed by maintaining a competitive exchange rate, reduction of inflation, laying down standards for fiscal policy, budget deficit to be brought down, the quality of government spending, and external debt to be brought down. There's this very famous name in economics, Jacques Polak. Jacques Polak was the director of research at the International Monetary Fund, and he was the man who came up with a dynamic equilibrium model for countries to come back to attain balance of payment stability. So when I used to work on the IMF, we would go down to Raghuram Rajan's office, who succeeded Polak, and Raghu would say, oh, here's a simple formula that Polak has designed, and let's just put in the numbers and see where it goes. And if the fiscal adjustment, say, for Turkey was 7.5% a year, so that is what the fund would advise. In case you want to get $500 million from the fund, you please adjust your fiscal balances by this number. India has availed of 3 IMF programs. The first one was in 1966. And as I pointed out to you, the first step for any fund program is having a depreciation of your currency. So we had devalued our currency by 36.5%. It was one of the sharpest devaluations we have witnessed in the history of Indian democracy. The second program was availed in 1981. It was a $5 billion program. It's a low conditionality program. And the third one was the 1991 program, which witnessed major economic reforms. When we joined service, we were told that Indian economy is on a downswing, and we were heading for a basket case of an economy. And then the turnaround came, because a group of policymakers that were led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, comprising of Dr. Rangarajan, Dr. Monte Ahluwalia, Shankaracharya, a group of them came together, and subsequently Bimal Jalan, Y.V. Reddy, Duvur Subbarao, they came together to put together a policy of economic and social reforms that transformed us into a sustainable high-growth economy. This is a cartoon of those days. You have the managing director of the IMF, who's represented on the left side of the cartoon, who's represented here. If anybody just asks, say, nobody twisted our arms, we twisted them ourselves. So high was the conditionality for us to get these $1,650 million. Let me take you through the 1966 program. The 1966 program was one of the most complex. It was the first crisis that Mrs. Gandhi faced. And the reason she faced it was governments like to be profligate. We'd like to have high wages. We'd like to give high subsidies. Our oil subsidies are very high. Our fertilizer subsidies are high. Our food subsidies are high. There's always a burgeoning fiscal deficit which is monetized by the Reserve Bank of India. And this is what happened. India's balance of payments problem was under pressure throughout in 1965, and the difficulties continued in 1966, necessitating a sizable use of fund resources despite severe tightening of restrictions. As 1965 opened, foreign exchange reserves had already been reduced to a low level by increased payments for food inputs, occasioned by the shortfall in domestic production and by delays in repatriation of export proceeds. In March, a standby arrangement of $200 million was approved by the fund. If you read, those of you from the Foreign Service can go back and look up from the State Department's archives in the United States State Department, the conversations that occurred between the American president and the Prime Minister on the eve of India's fund program. And as what my good friend Prabhakar Narvekar tells me, that she visited the fund and she was so angry that she was advised a devaluation that she marched out. And after 1966, the Indian Prime Minister did not visit the United States till almost 1983. That was a gap of 17 years. So strong were her emotions at that point of time with the kind of policy measures that were recommended for our fiscal adjustments. This is a clipping from 1966. The Hindu of 1966 says the rupee devalued US dollar to cost rupees 750. This is the first devaluation that occurred in the Indian economy since 1947. The rupee was devalued by 36.5% to bring domestic prices in line with external prices, to enhance the competitiveness of exports. Whenever a currency is depreciated, the exports become more competitive. Unfortunately, although despite this kind of high level of devaluation, the export competitiveness could not be achieved. The US dollar, which was 475, rose to 750, and the pound rose from 1333 to 21 rupees. It was hoped that such a kind of devaluation would bring a substantial increase in Indian exports. We also expected a whole lot of foreign aid. A huge amount of foreign aid was to be worked through the World Bank's aid consortium. However, it took months in coming. It didn't come easily because the top 5 countries started imposing tremendous pressure on us to enforce their views of the Indian economy. India didn't have a 4th plan. We had to abandon the 4th plan in favor of 3 annual plans in the wake of severe disruptions in economy on account of 2 years of drought, 2 successive wars, and the devaluation of the rupee. The annual plans guided our economic progress. How did the Prime Minister sell this 1966 program to the people? Even then, the All India Radio would broadcast what is called a person-to-person program. And in this person-to-person program, what she said was, the fear that we had sold out under Western pressure or that we are likely to be dominated by foreign capital is absurd. The commanding heights will always be with us. We seek more aid at this juncture in order to end aid. The government is fully committed to the objective of a socialist, democratic society, but it is not wedded to any dogma. Our socialism was one that was related to the country's needs and aspirations and the reality of the Indian situation. This devaluation failed. It did not achieve its objectives. The adjustment in relative prices and the pattern of investment necessitated by the devaluation proved even more difficult because of the severe drought, which affected the Indian economy. The promised foreign aid did not materialize. It took a lot of effort to sell this idea of borrowing from a foreign institution within the country. And Mr. Sachindra Chaudhary, who was the then finance minister, he had to lose his job because he could not explain this concept to the nation. The governor of the Reserve Bank of India, P.C. Bhattacharya, who also was not very much involved with the devaluation effort and lost his job, said that the devaluation was only a beginning and all efforts would be made to contain the inflationary pressures and promote internal discipline. Now, this was what we were promised, and this is the Hindu of 1966, which says India seeks rupees 5,000 crores aid from consortium. So this is the World Bank consortium led by the P5 countries that had promised us 5,000 crores of aid in 1966. India was grappling for food. The PL 480 was the big wheat consignment that had to come from the United States, was quite delayed. And despite the package of policy measures that were announced in June 1966 by the government of India, 8 commitments never approached the levels which the Indian government expected from the World Bank or from the other member countries. The 8 commitments which were made were $900 million annually for 3 years from the bank and a $300 million project assistance from the United States. Now, the first tranche that came to us was merely about $295 million. And then the second tranche of $642 million took an eternity to come. Let me come to the 1981 program. The 1981 program was implemented at a time when the oil crisis was at its peak, and many countries had to undergo massive adjustments. India once again faced a balance of payments crisis, and we had to implement some form of low or no conditionality period in the fund when we wanted to borrow some money to protect our balance of payments. And at that point of time, the conditionality rules were liberalized. The fund was not very insistent on the Polak model of fiscal tightening or devaluation. This was how the scenario looked in 1979-80. The balance of payment situation changed dramatically in 79-80 as agriculture growth suffered and industrial bottlenecks emerged. Inflation soared from 3% to 22%. It's almost like Zimbabwe. Suddenly you have 1,000,000% inflation. And it was unwieldy. It was very difficult to bring it down. The external terms of trade worsened significantly, owing to higher prices of imported petroleum and fertilizers. The trade deficit zoomed. The government undertook deficit financing on an unprecedented scale, and bank lending to both food and non-food sectors contributed to the rise of credit in the commercial sector. To meet this short-term cyclical imbalance, India drew 266 million SDRs from the IMF. But even so, the country's reserves dwindled down to 3.5 months. Dr. M. Narasimhan is a man of great eminence. He started as just a probationary officer in the Reserve Bank of India and went on to rise to the Governor Reserve Bank. And when I met him last month, he's almost 93 now. He's served on many jobs. But what he remembered was his negotiations with the IMF board and with the United States government. He did recall that he and Dr. K.R. Narayan, who went on to become the President of India, and at that point of time, the ambassador of India to the United States visited the United States Treasury Secretary's office to plead for a $5 billion support from the IMF, because the US holds about 17.5% vote on the IMF board. And they were politely said that, no, you please go to the markets and raise the money, because what you intend to do is you want to buy MiG aircraft. So the United States did not support the proposal. But Narasimhan was a master at negotiations. And in fact, he recalls, if you read the paper that I've circulated to you, he recalls that he presented the urgent need for an IMF program to Mr. R. Venkatraman, who was the then finance minister, and Malhotra, who was the finance secretary. And both of them were not willing to even look at an IMF program. In his departing note, he does get time from Indira Gandhi, whom he requests that he is willing to negotiate a $5 billion fund, a $5 billion loan, in consultation with one of his good friends, the former Minister of Finance for France, who goes on to become the managing director of the IMF, Jacques Delors. So Delors, along with Narasimhan, try and convince the 24-member executive board to vote for this huge economic program for India. And this is what Narasimhan says. Narasimhan says that in November 1981, the discussion on the executive board took place all day. Every single executive director spoke, all 20 of them. My reply took 1 hour. I responded to each one of them. I maintained that Government of India's policy on exchange rates would be guided by its balance of payments. I said that India is not walking into the fund on a stretcher. We are walking into the fund like walking into a clinic. I added that the IMF should not be regarded only as a lender of last resort. It was a cooperative, and it was natural for countries to turn to the cooperative lending institution before seeking other sources of finance. And I added that India has been a responsible member of the fund and we would continue to be so. We wanted this more as a backup to our reserves so that we could continue with our program of liberalization. Now, Narasimhan was one of the best executive directors India's had on the IMF, and the IMF board with its round table is quite imposing. And the fact that this man could address them for a full day to get this $5 billion got him a Padma Vibhushan. The 1981 IMF program was widely supported by the media as compared to the 1966 program when the government got flayed for the kind of devaluation, because it was a low conditionality program. And India was in the peak of its socialist drive, wherein which the larger welfare state was the norm. So the Economic and Political Weekly in November 1981 said that an interesting reaffirmation being made by those who negotiated the IMF loan is that the terms and conditions laid down by the IMF are, after all, no different from the strategy of India's own sixth five-year plan. Despite EPW's critique, it was seen that that was exactly what it was so. Mr. Narasimhan had negotiated a low conditionality program which really did not bring about any kind of economic reform in the country. Mr. Pranab Mukherjee succeeded Venkatraman as the finance minister, and introducing the budget of 84-85, this is what he said: our strategy for bringing balance of payments under control after a sharp deterioration has paid rich dividends. In view of the improvements in our payments position, the government has decided not to avail of the balance 1.1 billion. So out of the 5 billion, India required only 3.9 billion of the reserves that were promised to us. And the Prime Minister said this: the program did not force us to borrow, nor shall we borrow unless it is in national interest. There is absolutely no question of our accepting any program which is incompatible with our policy declared and accepted by Parliament. She further said that it is inconceivable that anybody should think we should accept assistance from any external agency which dictates terms which are not in consonance with such policies. This was true then, and it is true now. So we went into a low conditionality program, and Rahul Kullar is a 75 batch officer whom I got to serve quite closely with for 4 years. He served as private secretary to the finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, during the 1991 program. And Rahul Kullar says, it's quite surprising that India went through the 1981 IMF program without any major reforms. Mr. Narasimhan, who negotiated the IMF program, did not yield much ground on the reform front. He assured the Prime Minister that he had succeeded in persuading the IMF to permit flexibility. In 1981 to 84 period, government did start some basic changes, which was establishing the special economic zones. However, there were no major overhauling reforms. Gradualism ruled. What happened was that we had 2 programs, and still economic reforms had not set in. And that was what led to a major crisis by 1991. It was also said that the complacency caused by the findings of oil reserves at Bombay High resulted in a massive fiscal expansion, and we wanted to subsidize many industries more and more. In fact, the public sector enterprises did not yield the kind of results that we were looking at, causing a severe burden on the state. So expansionary fiscal policy continued in the 1980s, and the automatic monetization of budgetary deficits by issuing ad hoc treasury bills strained our credit policy. So we entered 1990s with structural rigidities and imbalances in the economy, pronounced macroeconomic imbalances, despite significant growth rate of 5%. Several adverse domestic and external developments precipitated the balance of payments crisis in 1991. From this crisis emerged a comprehensive reform agenda which encompassed industry, it encompassed trade, it encompassed the dismantling of the entire license Raj regime. We also formulated what was called a long-term fiscal policy. A long-term fiscal policy which was formulated in pursuance of the commitment given by government in the Union Budget 85-86. It was to bring together several divergent departments that worked on fiscal issues. So and also formulate what was called rules-based fiscal and financial policies. And there was to be coordination between the fiscal policy, the monetary policy, the industrial policy, and the trade policy. And it was to be an effective vehicle for strengthening the operational linkages between the various departments. However, politics took over, and the long-term fiscal policy never saw the light of the day. It envisaged fiscal deficits of 1.5%. We ended up with fiscal deficits of something like 10.5%, because India kept borrowing. India kept borrowing from the RBI, and deficits were being monetized, causing a massive run on our finances. The economic surveys, which are the red lights for indicating an economic crisis, did bring out in considerable measure that we were heading for a major crisis of 1991. And the balance of payment situation has remained under considerable pressure during 89-90, despite a buoyant trend in exports and a slowdown in the growth of imports. Deterioration in our balance of payments position during the 7th plan period is due to unfavorable factors such as deceleration in the growth of domestic oil production and bunching of repayment obligations to the IMF and other sources. What had happened was our drilling operations at the Bombay High had virtually reached saturation level, and India needed to bring in huge amounts of crude oil imports to finance its oil needs. The continuing strain on our balance of payments is reflected in the steep depletion of foreign exchange reserves, which stood at 5,531 crores at the end of January 1990. It's an alarming situation, and one that is almost scary, that the country just had 10 days of foreign exchange reserves. In fact, Ambassador Naresh Chandra, when I was liaison officer to him, he'd come and said, "Oh, I just come back from London, we've pledged our gold." So he had carried gold in 4 aircraft to London. The country's economic situation had become so fragile that a gold pledging on paper transaction, which was normally there, was not accepted to the bankers of London. We had to carry gold physically in aircraft and show it to them that the country is carrying gold so that we can pledge. It was that kind. The credibility of the nation had actually deteriorated to that extent, both in terms of fiscal policy and in monetary policy. And we were being compared to a basket economy. Now, what was the problem? The problem was fiscal imbalance. There was inflation, and there was a difficult balance of payments position. We had to have oil imports, we had to have food imports, and our subsidy bills were very high. The restraint on expenditure required careful consideration on the areas of public spending involving explicit and implicit subsidies. Many of you would go on to work in various ministries. Some of you would be working on the taxation side, some would be working in the expenditure side, and you'd realize that it's very difficult to cut subsidies. It's very, very difficult. I came back from the IMF as the finance secretary handling the budget, and every time I took to the cabinet a proposal for an expenditure cut, I found that I was being overruled, because expenditure rigidities, there are structural rigidities in expenditure. There are tremendous pressure groups to cut expenses. And on the revenue side, you'll find that the major challenge is tax compliance. Tax evasion was rampant, generating black money, fueling inflation and conspicuous consumption. Black money was also generated by shortages, artificially pegged prices, and detailed physical controls. There were massive leakages in the economy. And then the monetization of the fiscal deficit resulted in the higher liquidity growth over and above the overhang of liquidity that we'd carried in the previous years. Now, this was what the 1991-92 economic survey said. We had 5,530 crores the previous one, and we just had far lesser. 5,480 crores is what it says as of end August 1990, and 1,666 crores as of 16 January 1991. This is where the Manmohan Singh's budget comes in, and Manmohan Singh's budget of 1991 is a document that one must read, because it's a fascinating document as to how the vision of economic reform is laid out. And I would urge each one of you, just go to the library and pick up a copy of the 1991 budget, and it's comparable with Chidambaram's budget of 1997, which was again a high-growth economic budget. And we made an immediate purchase from the IMF, which amounted to roughly about 3,300 crores. And in spite of an IMF program and 2 successive depreciations, we devaluated by almost 39% in 1991. their run on the economy continued. This is what we needed. We needed 1,656 million. That's what the finance minister wrote to the IMF. And Jacques Camdessous came over a number of times, and Raul Kuller says that they used to sit in Geeta Krishnan's room, N.K. Singh, Geeta Krishnan, Montego Ahluwalia, and they would discuss how the policy was to be formulated over the next 3 months. Every 3 months, IMF teams would descend in Delhi and identify the major reform measures that were to be undertaken. It was one of the longest hours of work that any civil servant could put in, because the country was in so much of a crisis that we needed to get out of it through major economic reform. This was the 1991 program. The first thing they did was that we're going to cap borrowings. There used to be ceilings on domestic assets of the RBI, a sub-ceiling on RBI's credit to the government. The fiscal expansion that was expected was stopped. That was the first step. The second one they did was they increased prices. They cut subsidies, and they opened up the economy. For example, for Bangladesh to send its textiles to India, say apparels, there used to be massive tariffs. India lowered its tariff walls so that imports could come in at lower prices. Many of you may not recall, in the 1990s, all that we had was a Maruti car. We could hardly see the Toyotas or Hondas on the Indian streets. It was only when we liberalized could we see these imported cars. It not only brought down our own car prices, but it brought considerable competition to the markets. These were the fund recommendations. They kept a ceiling on fiscal deficit, and the current account deficit was also frozen. And structural benchmarks were imposed on industrial policy reform, trade liberalization, domestic pricing, public enterprise reforms, financial sector reforms, tax reforms, and expenditure control. And out of this, we emerged quite quickly. And after a series of very harsh measures, did India come out. In fact, the fiscal adjustment of 1.5% per annum for an economy of our size is quite rigid. And the country came out of this major crisis quite quickly by 1993. And the finance minister was called many times. The left parties were at him. He was asked to resign, and he kept on saying that we are founder members of these two institutions, the IMF and World Bank, and it is our right to borrow from them, and we need assistance in support of our programs. And they kept on defending. They kept on defending. The next crisis that India faced was the 2008 global financial crisis, and it took everybody by storm. There was this great man who headed the United States Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. And Alan Greenspan headed the US Federal Reserve for 17 years, making it the greatest economy in the world. And in the later part of the Greenspan years, he spawned a housing revolution with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two housing companies which gave huge amount of loans for massive expansion in housing projects. Suddenly, Lehman Brothers, which was the banker for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, collapsed. And the minute that happened, there was a global crisis. By 2009, we were on the world economic scene. We were growing at 8.6%, and we could be transformed like China as a $1 trillion economy, and we could bring down poverty massively. However, we were hit by the 2008 global financial crisis, and rupee collapsed, lost 20% of its value within a day and touching 50 rupees a dollar, and there was a global financial freeze. The government borrowing rose sharply, and the growth forecast, which was revised from 9% to 7.5%. In fact, from 2004 to 2009, we had the spurt of growth. It was a massive growth spurt, and India could actually be seen as shining. This is one that says, one of the cartoons we picked. This is United States which falls sick, and there is a global contagion immediately. In fact, if you read Duvur Subbarao's book, and it's a good book that he's written, Who Moved My Interest Rate? Has anybody read it? Has anybody read Duvur Subbarao's book? Chapter 1, Duvur Subbarao goes as Governor RBI to the IMFC, the International Monetary and Financial Committee in Washington, and there is this very haggardly looking man who walks in the middle of the discussions. And to his great surprise, he sees that it is President Bush who's walking in with shoulders slouched, unshaven, and looking quite haggardly to seek the global cooperation for resolving the 2008-9 crisis. I think it's a book worth reading. Please pick it up. It's available in the library. I just saw it. And Who Moved My Interest Rate? That's what it's called. It's a 2016 publication by Penguin. So, in fact, Subbarao tries to assure the market that please calm down. We are quite decoupled from the global scenario. However, the markets are in a state of complete panic, and the Indian economy slows down significantly. And the global economy slowed down, and India too was affected. And for the first time in 9 months, the growth rate of exports came down to 17%. We were growing by almost 30%. So, for example, some cities like Tirupur witnessed major job losses because Indian exports collapsed. And in these difficult times, when most economies were struggling to stay afloat, we did have a growth rate. And how did we come out of this slump? The policy response was there was a stimulated, substantial fiscal stimulus that was provided through 2 packages, December 7, 2008, and January 2, 2009, to provide tax relief to boost demand. Now, suddenly you have these growth numbers that TC Anand has put out last week or last month, which says that Indian economic growth has come down to 5.7% from 7.1. Now, immediately, the government's policy response is that we're going to provide a fiscal stimulus of almost $7.7 billion. So that is the kind of response that is needed to bring the Indian economy back on track. And this is exactly what they did in 2008. They gave a fiscal stimulus, they eased monetary policy, and liquidity-enhancing measures were introduced so that more money was available in the system. If you saw the first 2 programs, or first 3 programs of 66, 81, and 91, we had to tighten our belts. In 2008, we had to loosen the belt because there was no money available in the market. India's forex reserves, we started buying dollars in the market, went up from 247 billion to 254 billion. Everybody else had also added dollars. And the Chinese had added something like $8.2 billion at this period of time because everybody feared a global contagion which would actually crash the global economy. Now, this is the Economic Times of 2009, February 19, 2009, and I wanted to share this with you. That's the first time that rupee breached the rupees 50 mark. The only other time when I saw a run on the rupee of this nature was subsequently in 2013 when rupee collapsed to 68 rupees a dollar, 68 rupees a dollar. So in spite of whatever the governor said, the RBI governor said, on lower inflation, low current account deficit, the market simply would not respond. This was what the IMF recommended to us. We were no longer a program country, so they said that please sustain your liquidity and credit flow. The monetary and structural policies should be given the high public debt to GDP ratio. They said that please adjust your policy accordingly. And they said no capital account liberalization for now because you may have a major run on the portfolio investments and on the capital investments that are coming in. And they wanted us to spend on infrastructure financing. Infrastructure and poverty-related spending was to be increased. We were the first economy to recover after the 2010 global crisis. There was a prompt fiscal and monetary policy easing. The growth was projected to rise from 6 3/4% to 8%. And the IMF commended RBI for commencing the first phase of exit from monetary accommodation and generally considered that conditions were right for progressive normalization of the monetary stance. So gradually, India recovered. And from 2010, by 2016, we became the fastest growing major economy in the world. And this was how it looked. How does India look as the fastest growing major economy in the world? In so many years in the IMF and following it up, we always felt that we weren't growing to our potential. And suddenly we had this big tag and people were very proud about it. And we had a growth rate of 7.2%. Foreign exchange reserves were 372 billion. Current account deficit was 1.1%. And inflation was quite low at 5%. So the economic transformation from an IMF program country to the world's fastest growing major economy in a period of 25 years, this is what the significant success of the Indian economy is. And it happened because there were a series of policymakers that made it happen. There are two more things I did bring to your notice. I'll highlight two features more. One was, of course, the contribution of the Reserve Bank of India to economic policy making. And the second is the contribution of Planning Commission and how the Planning Commission changed to the Niti Aayog. Now, these are important things, and I'd not dwell too long on these. The Reserve Bank of India was established in 1935. It's one of the oldest institutions that we have in the country today. And the first governor, the British would not trust us with an Indian governor. They brought in an Australian to head the Reserve Bank, Sir Osborne Smith. And Sir Osborne Smith was dismissed within a period of 2 years because they found that he was temperamentally incompatible. And the next man they identified was an Indian, a brilliant civil service officer, Chintaman Deshmukh. And every time I read the works and speeches of Chintaman Deshmukh, his vision is quite amazing. He would not increase the interest rate. He believed that a stable interest rate was the way to progress. And the first time that the interest rates were increased was between 1935 to 1951. The RBI held interest rates. The rupee was rock solid. In fact, Mr. Rangarajan tells me that after the 1991 crisis, throughout his governorship up to 1997, the rupee remained rock solid between rupees 30.61 to rupees 30.81. That is what it was. And Chintaman Deshmukh was one of the first governors who believed that the rupee should be rock solid, and he held it at that level. The other components with regard to the banking technology innovations, with regard to the sheer changes, the revolutions in fintech, these are some things. I will leave the paper with Saurabh so that he can circulate to you as to what has happened. And the third thing is the Niti Aayog. The Niti Aayog is something that is quite new. It is the youngest institution of our democracy. And the Niti Aayog has emanated from the Planning Commission after 12 5-year plans. It's been a huge amount of central planning, and it was felt that policy fatigue and mission creep had crept into the Planning Commission. And this new concept of cooperative federalism and simplifying processes for public-private investment over a 3-year framework rather than a 5-year framework is working quite well. They came up with a model land leasing law. They've also come up with policies for promoting disinvestment. So even this paper of mine, I'll leave with Saurabh, and you can run through it. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for the attention, and I wish you all a wonderful future. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take a few questions. Otherwise, we can break for lunch. Any questions? Okay, there's none. We can break for lunch.
Sir, I, on behalf of the 92nd Foundation Course Batch and the Academy, thank you for coming here to guide us all. Your insights on institution building, fiscal policy, and multilateralism will help us all in our careers ahead. Today, when we all begin our career in civil services, public servants like you inspire us as role models. Sir, we salute you for your service to the nation. Now, on behalf of the 92nd Foundation Course Batch and the Academy, I would like to invite my fellow officer trainee, Mr. Ganga Singh, to present a memento as a token of appreciation and gratitude.